Former President Trump will be sentenced as a convicted felon on July 11th. But, major point, he is still legally allowed to continue his campaign for president. This afternoon, we're joined virtually by Boise State political science professor Dr. Charlie Hunt to talk about the verdict and the impact it'll have on the 2024 election. Dr. Hunt, this is clearly a historic decision. He is now the first former president to be a convicted felon. I'm curious, how do you believe this changes the political landscape, or does it change it?
I'm not sure whether it changes it or not, Joe. It's really too early to say, partly because of how unprecedented this is. We've never had a president convicted of a felony before. I believe Ulysses Grant was the only one convicted of a misdemeanor for driving his carriage too fast. We know up to this point that anywhere from 10% to a third of Trump voters have said in polls that they would reconsider doing so if he were convicted of a felony. And so that would be a huge number if that proves to be true. I'm skeptical that number is that high. At the same time, people already tend to know how they feel about Trump. We had him for 4 years as president. He was a known quantity before that. So I'm skeptical whether or not this is really going to change a lot of people's minds about him. You know, those who love him, those who don't. And I think we saw that in the reactions from voters that we saw on the street today.
And as soon as the trial began, it was initially divisive, and I think many expected it to be. It came a question, though, of is this going to impact the presidential race? Are we going to see this rally Trump's campaign? I'm curious, do you think this might help the former president?
I think in some ways it already has. We saw this afternoon that the Trump campaign reported that in the 24 hours following the verdict, they got $35 million in campaign donations. It was a single day record. We saw similar kinds of reactions after his mugshot came out in the Georgia case last year. And so, for his diehard supporters, this is just kind of more proof that he's being persecuted, that as one of the voters we saw said, he's done nothing wrong. But Donald Trump's problem is that those types of supporters alone are not enough to win him this election. There are a lot of Americans out there who may not love Joe Biden, but are not comfortable voting for Donald Trump yet. And this is just such uncharted territory that it's really tough to say at this point whether that's going to sort of push voters one way or the other.
And I think we've started to see an indication of this already today. But my question for you, how do you see the former president handling the verdict as he continues his campaign?
I'm sure with his usual calmness and sobriety that we're used to from him. No, I mean, he's lashed out at the judge, he's lashed out at the prosecutors, called it a disgrace, a con job, etc. All the kinds of usual stuff. On the other hand, it's, how do you run for president as a convicted felon? This is, like we said, uncharted territory on the legal side. But I think on the political side, this is in a lot of ways typical territory for Trump. This is not the first scandal he has ever faced. He has his playbook for how to do it, right? To sort of go after those who are against him, to sort of talk about the judge as corrupt, to talk about the system as corrupt. This was one of the bases of his initial campaign. So, we'll see how far that gets him in the coming weeks and months.
And we know that the judge in this case has some room in sentencing. We know that there can be a massive fine. There could also be up to 4 years in prison. We'll keep an eye on that. It's hard to guess what will happen. On the other side of the coin, of course, you have the incumbent, current President Joe Biden. We've seen some statements from the White House. Do you think this is something that the Biden campaign will continue to point to, or do you think maybe they'll try to move on and start preparing for things like the debate?
It's tricky territory, right? And it's important to disentangle this message from the Biden campaign with that from the White House, right? This is something the Trump White House didn't always do so effectively. So you saw from the White House a response along the lines of, we respect the rule of law and we have no further comment. The Biden campaign has just emphasized the importance of beating Trump in November, doesn't seem too eager to wade in on the legal side. And part of this, I think, is because Trump is trying to tie Joe Biden and the White House to this verdict. That, this idea that this is all just a political hit job, just in time for an election year. We should be clear that this is totally misleading, right? The Department of Justice passed on trying this case as a federal crime. This is New York state law we're talking about. So Joe Biden really not involved here. But, as Trump does this, it would probably be smarter for Biden to make this kind of more of a reflection on what Trump would do if he's elected again, right? To try and tie it to a lawless kind of second term that Trump might have in mind. I'll say it for the fourth time. This is uncharted territory. This is going to come up in a presidential debate if they do end up having the debates. So I am really curious to see how both campaigns handle this.
Congressional and presidential expert Dr. Charlie Hunt from the Boise State Political Science Department. Thank you so much for joining us live here on the News at 4. We'll check in with you soon. I'm sure there'll be a lot to get into in this conversation.